Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a discussion about human rights and governance in Uganda. My name is Maria Burnett. I'm a non-resident senior associate here with CSIS, and I'm really glad everyone could join us today. I'm honored to be joined by two guests who know the situation in Uganda extremely well. Agather Atuhaire, an award-winning investigative journalist and activist, and Nicholas Opio, the founder and head of Chapter 4 Uganda and a leading human rights lawyer in Uganda. We had a plan to discuss a range of issues this morning related to corruption and human rights issues, but in light of the fact that Uganda's Constitutional Court ruled today in the long-awaited challenge to the Anti-Homosexuality Act, we are happy that Nicholas, who was one of the lawyers on that case, could join us this morning to have a brief discussion about what today's ruling means and how those issues will likely play out both in the courts of law and in popular opinion as well, and what it means for different funders and stakeholders who engage in Uganda going forward. So our conversation about corruption and human rights will continue as planned, but we're going to have a brief focus on the ruling today, given that by all coincidences, that ruling came out today after everyone had been waiting for almost a year. So Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn to you first. As I said, the ruling was just a few hours ago, so we're in a privileged position to have late-breaking news and to have you join us. Could you share with us a bit about the ruling and how the ruling went this morning?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and sorry, Agatha, for bombing your session with Maria because of the breaking news here in Uganda. As Maria correctly stated, today at about 10 a.m. Ugandan time, the Ugandan Supreme Court, the Ugandan Constitutional Court delivered its decision on the challenge to Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act. The notice of judgment was given to the lawyers a little under 12 hours before the actual decision. The court only read a summary of its decision and has just sent to us a few minutes ago their detailed ruling, which is in excess of 200 pages. And so the lawyers are still poring over the full decision of the court to see the basis, the reasoning of the court in arriving at its decision. But from the summary of the court judgment, there were a couple of things that stood out in our view. First, the court rejected every single preliminary procedure arguments. And what was really so striking was on the question of public consultations, where the court held that there was no need for Parliament to get engaged in extensive public consultations, and that given the wide public sentiment around the law, the views of the LGBTI community would have anyway been inconsequential. The courts, even though faulted the Speaker of Parliament for her conduct while enacting this law, argued that those violations of the rules of procedure of Parliament by the Speaker do not go into the question of the constitutionality of the law itself. On the substantive arguments, the courts, in large parts, really upheld the law in the sense that the courts found that there was no ambiguity. For instance, in sections 6 and 14 of the AHA, we had argued that words such as promotion of homosexuality were overly broad and provide a catch-all phrase that make it difficult to understand the nature of the offenses that is criminalized. But the court held that those words were not in any way ambiguous. Again, the court relied on public sentiments to arrive at that decision. But the court made something very interesting as well and said the concept of dignity must not be used to obstruct or to vary what the court thought were cultural values of Ugandan national interest. The court also held that, in its decision, held that this law was intended to protect children. In other words, on top of relying on just public sentiments, the court also relies on unsubstantiated argument that there is child recruitment into homosexuality. And so the court just makes, very broad reference to child recruitment into homosexuality, and said this law was passed on the backdrop of wide, spread claim of recruitment into homosexuality. The court also, refused the argument of providing property for LGBT individuals, and said it does not in any way violate the rights of property owners and the rights of LGBT persons to own and live in a house, and declared that provision as constitutional. In other words, the court made very broad, arguments in upholding the law, relying broadly on public sentiments, public morality, national interest. All these are undefined. And in so doing, also nullified a few really consequential provisions. The court nullified the provisions of Section 3, subsection 2, and Section 9 for infringing on the adequate standard of living of LGBTI persons. And the court also struck down the reporting obligation that was required of everybody. So in brief, really, that is the finding of the court. Now, many of us were not surprised, given the conservative-leaning nature of the bench that sat to hear the case. Many of them are active members of the Christian movement here in Uganda who were behind the law. What was really surprising is that the court was relying on public sentiments, cultural values, and national values in arriving at its decision. It's a very strange argument, strange ruling. We are still reading the details of it, and we will have a statement once we go over the entire decision.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicholas. So just to circle back, substantively, what this ruling did was really uphold the government's ability to discriminate in healthcare settings, for example, and to uphold the notion that state-orchestrated violence towards LGBTI people will be permitted. I know there's been a lot of research done into the impact of this law just in, the few months that since it was passed, a year ago, I guess now. But the research indicated that there was a real increase in abuses directed towards LGBTI people, an increase in discrimination in healthcare settings. And so in your view, just to be clear here, the kind of abuses that were documented in the wake of the law passing can now continue under this ruling. Really, nothing has been substantially changed by today's ruling. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The court, in fact, says they cannot issue an injunction to stop the implementation of the law, essentially saying the violations that have been continuing can continue. But substantively, the court endorses the discrimination of LGBTIQ individuals primarily because it serves a national interest, it serves a moral interest, it also preserves cultural values, and specifically the court said the notion of same-sex conduct would run counterproductive to crimes such as bestiality and incest. I found that very insensitive for the court. The court goes on to say that anal sex causes harm, essentially suggesting that all LGBTI persons are involved in anal sex and that it is a burden on the country's meager resources. So the court really has endorsed the discrimination of LGBTI individuals and says we cannot put the individual interest of LGBTI persons over and above societal common good and national interest. Those are the words of the court. And essentially what the court is saying, that the violations that have been documented are justified and can continue. Secondly, the simple question before the court was whether the equal protection of law applies to everybody in this country, regardless of whether we like them or we don't. The court has essentially said, equal protection of the law does not apply to LGBTI individuals in Uganda, and that they can be prosecuted, they can be discriminated, they can be treated less than other Ugandans, really, essentially. That's what the court has said.
Yeah, and I know there's been, obviously, since the law was passed, a lot of debate about the role of, let's say, non-Ugandans in pushing for this law. And I was just wondering, I mean, maybe to put some context around this, several African countries have decriminalized same-sex conduct. South Africa, Mauritius, Gabon, Angola. There's really been, in several of the smaller island nations, there's really been several positive developments for the rights of LGBTI people around the continent. And at the same time, there was quite a bit of documentation that there had been American evangelicals pushing for this law to be passed. So is there anything that you want to comment on about, what this ruling reflects on when it talks about Uganda's cultural values, given that Uganda's been a bit of a battleground for foreign influence around homophobia?
Look, Uganda is a diverse community. There's no one single issue you can point to and call our national cultural value. Uganda is a country of over 68 different ethnic groups. Even within those ethnic groups, there are differences. So this whole argument about cultural values is a hollow argument. It is an excuse for the enactment of laws such as the law in Uganda. But secondly, what is certainly clear is that there is a very strong influence of religious groups around this argument. In 2014, 10 years ago, it was American evangelical groups. Now it is their local counterparts and actors who have been behind this law. The judges bent over backwards to include 2 pastors and the Family Life Network as respondents in the case, even though there was no legal basis for their inclusion. So there's a very strong Christian religious influence on this law. What in fact is happening is that homophobia and hatred is being introduced in Uganda through these Christian groups and their preachings. But additionally, many people have said development partners should keep out of this. This is our war. We can only fight it if it is a Ugandan war. That argument, in my view, is false, because I think that this is no longer just a Ugandan issue. This has become an international issue. In any event, we are members of the international community. We are signatories to human rights instruments that require the protection of our LGBTI folks. It is important that the international community engages in this debate in much the same way as ordinary Ugandans should engage with this issue and ensure that we provide equal protection of the law to every single Ugandan.
Yeah, and in the wake of the law over the last year, there was an end of loans to Uganda from the World Bank, and several other multilateral institutions either spoke out or changed their approach. We know that some of the, diplomatic partners to Uganda have changed their programming around or sought to end support that was given through government channels to revert to NGO channels. Do you think that this ruling today changes any of those actions? Obviously, the World Bank in particular has been reflecting on what mitigation measures might be possible. What are your thoughts on what today's ruling means for how multilateral organizations that have a real fundamental commitment to non-discrimination in the way their lending occurs, how should they respond based on today's ruling?
This law changes nothing. In any way, this law only entrenches that which these development partners found objectionable. In other words, there's absolutely nothing to mitigate except the repeal of the law, because you cannot mitigate the heinous, broad sweeping provisions provided in the law. So groups such as the World Bank must realize that any mitigation measures would not be meaningful except the repeal of the AHA, because the AHA inherently discriminates against a section of Ugandans simply based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. Secondly, they must hold the line. Oftentimes, when these development partners make these demands, the regime in Kampala is quite happy to wait them out because they know they will always walk back. They must hold the line and hold the Ugandan government accountable to the standards that they have signed up to. Because if you allow what is happening to Uganda to go without any consequences, it is just going to be the same in other African countries, because similar laws are now being discussed and promoted by the same groups that were actively involved in Uganda. Uganda is a watershed moment and will lay down the rules of the engagement of the international community on this subject across the African continent in years to come. It's going to happen in Ghana. It's going to happen in other countries where this law is being discussed, including Kenya. And so, in continuing engaging in the Ugandan argument and setting the standard that meets these obligations is going to be important. And as I said, you cannot mitigate such a bad law. The only thing to do is to repeal that law. Secondly, people must give the LGBTI community in Uganda a lot of support, because it feels like it's a dark moment for them. People were crying in court. Some of them were lawyers. And if people walk away and walk back these demands they have made from the Ugandan community, it will put the LGBTI community in peril. It will also put allies in peril, people who have been working tirelessly to ensure equal access to healthcare, equal access to opportunities, to employment, proper treatment under the law, due process, whose work will now become criminalized simply on account of the fact that they are working with people who are perceived to be or who are self-declared as LGBTI persons. And so it's really important for a wide section of the community that we keep this engagement and hold the line and not talk about any meaningless mitigation measures, because nothing can mitigate such a bad law except its repeal.
Yeah, so just to end on the way forward, I know you all are just digesting the opinion from court in the last few hours, but what do you see as the possible next steps for the legal team? What are other pathways you all are reflecting on to continue to push on the potential repeal of this law?
This law and this judgment will be challenged in the Supreme Court. That process is well underway. Discussions are now being held with the affected communities to ensure we do it in the best way we can. But there's no doubt that such a bad ruling should not remain unchallenged. We will take this matter to the highest court possible to ensure that that court has an opportunity to pronounce itself. And regardless of what the Supreme Court say in this appeal that we will appeal, we will continue this debate even outside of the courtroom, that it doesn't stop with a court judgment. It's going to go back to the people, and we'll discuss it until that time when people understand that discrimination is bad for our community.
Thank you. I want to bring in Agather and turn to some of the topics that we had planned to discuss today. Many of us, I will say, including myself, have long felt that this issue of trying to criminalize NGO activism and to criminalize allyship and to kind of target the Uganda's LGBTI community has been a real diversionary tactic over the years, both in parliament and in the highest levels of government. And several of the topics that they were seeking to, have less focus on were topics we plan to discuss today, primarily, election-related human rights abuses, excesses by the security forces, violations of due process of law, and corruption, ongoing, unaddressed, really endemic corruption at the highest levels. So I want to turn specifically to discuss a bit around the legacy of the election-related abuses from 2021. I'll point out Uganda is scheduled to have elections again in 2026, so we're at a bit of a midpoint now. But the impact of the election-related abuses from 2021 remains. Opposition supporters remain behind bars, remain missing. There has been no accountability for the killing of almost at least 100 people in November 2020 during the campaigns. And Agatha, I know you've done a great deal of investigations into this work and are in close touch with many of the families. share with us a bit about what you see are the legacies of the election abuses from 2021, and maybe a bit also about how this is continuing to affect, political engagement and citizen engagement in political events in Uganda.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for having us here, the people of CSIS. I think you start from 2021 just to make it brief, but election violence has been in Uganda's history. Yeah, if we are even to just stick to the National Resistance Movement government that has been in power since 1986, the very first election in 1996 was violent. I think before 2021, 2001 election had gone in history as the most violent one. All those issues have never been resolved. People that die in every election. So every election in Uganda right now, even if it means local council election, is a matter of life and death. There was an election in Kayunga near Kampala over LC5 and there was still death of people and maiming. And so every election in Kampala has become a bloodshed event, and these issues are never resolved. Of course, 2021 becomes more critical because you had killings that were sporadic at first. There was a boxer that was killed called Zebra Senyange that the president came and admitted, my people are the ones that killed him. Up to now, we don't know which people. So he admits that the security people killed him. We have never seen anyone being tried for that and for killing someone for no reason, but it was also election related. Then you have the killings of November 18, where up to now the number, I don't know if Nicholas has the exact one, but it is about 100. And right now, up to this moment, no one has ever been held accountable for those killings. And the president went on TV and sort of chest thumped and said, we are a revolution or something like that. So saying we will kill you if you tamper with us. But also the Minister of Security that time, El Tumwine, who died also recently, had said, yeah, the state has a right to kill you. That's what he said. Now that was enough for us to know that there will never be any accountability for that. The children of those people, some of them, I and my friends are trying to hold their hand through school, and the state does not even take responsibility for that. So people died, you have not even held people that killed them accountable, but even their families are struggling to survive, to feed, and you have a government that doesn't think that that's at least the very least they could do. Then you have those that have been in jail since just before the election and after. We have 32 right now that have been in the General Court Martial, despite a ruling by the Constitutional Court saying that civilians should not be tried in the court martial. We had a discussion where we had the Justice and Constitutional Affairs Minister, and he said, I do not know why citizens like that. You're saying they were holding bottles, but armed robbers that rob with guns are tried in civilian courts. Why would you try these ones in the court martial? The Chief Justice has said that. But at the end of the day, it speaks to a broken system, where the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs know that that's illegal, where even the Chief Justice is talking about it as illegal. It takes the word of one man to decide what happens to people. There have been 4 bail applications, and all of them, I think the last one we are waiting for the ruling on the 15th of April, if I remember correctly. But the previous ones, the court sits and says the sureties are not substantial. Like collectively, like that, because you have brought about 60 sureties. And these sureties are parents, are local council people, now they are MPs. You are not even giving a reason for that, for ruling that they are not substantial. And this will only get worse. Their families sit there every day and cry, and these issues have been taken to the president, have been taken to the ministers, but nothing has been done. Now, when you see another election coming, when these people are still in jail, you are only going to wonder, are people going to be free to go and campaign for their people and participate in all the election activities, having seen the consequences that have befallen those that openly did. I think we have not yet talked about missing people. They are, I think the National Unity Platform talks about 18. That's the list they have. But there could be more that people do not know about yet. And all those, it's election related. No one knows whether they are in detentions. No one knows whether they are. And this has been an issue in the Parliament of Uganda, where the opposition MPs boycotted, walked out a couple of times. But of course, maybe that became unsustainable and they dropped it and they went and lodged the complaint in court. All that shows you that the next time a Ugandan is going to participate in this, in any election-related activity, they'll go knowing that they will either die or spend years in jail, but you will also not have many that are willing to take that risk. And the apathy that we have seen over the years will only get worse when you have people that would rather, survive than die in an election. So I think 2026 will be worse. The fear, but also the level of high-handedness, it increases by the day. When you see from 1996, like I was telling you to now, it only gets worse. So yeah, it's a dark, gloomy. Like when you think about it, you think that it will be worse, but it will also make many stay away.
I know Nicholas is not going to stay with us for the full hour. So, and I know, Nicholas, Chapter 4, and you have investigated several of the events around the 2021 elections, abuses during the campaign and after. I just want to give you the opportunity to weigh in here a bit. I think it would be helpful to understand both, what does prosecuting people before military courts kind of achieve politically for the government? And what do you see as the ongoing issues related to those abuses, and how it affects political engagement in Uganda going forward?
Well, for some time, the civilian courts have given reprieve to certain sections of the actors when arrested. You could apply for bail. You could appear in court and express how you're being treated in detention. You could get people to visit you. What happened in the last election was that was viewed as a problem. And so they began to shift people who are opponents of Museveni from the from the ordinary courts to the general court martial, because the general court martial really is not a court per se. It's inaccessible to people. Its members are not lawyers. They're ordinary military men without any legal qualification. The tribunal that sits to hear this case has no legal training. And they are soldiers who ultimately take orders. So the court was instrumentalized to solve a political problem, to hold people either incommunicado or for prolonged detention, to give these processes a veneer of legitimacy or legality, when in fact the whole process is inherently unlawful. It is not unsurprising, therefore, that opposition supporters who were arrested show up in the military courts and are quickly remanded in the absence of their lawyers, in the absence of their families, or in many cases, many of them after being severely tortured. So the military court is simply now instrumentalized, weaponized to address a political problem. It helps the government put away several people for a long time when they could have in ordinary courts applied for bail and been released, or even challenged the legality of their trials. In the military courts, you can argue all the law you want. They simply do not care. Secondly, this sends a strong message. It is intended to deflate, to discourage people who are involved in active opposition politics. And when you see people like Agather Atuhaire detained for nearly 3 years now, you have to be very strong-hearted to get engaged in the kind of work that she was doing. This is a young woman with kids detained for offenses clearly she didn't commit, but purely only because of her activism for the opposition, in this case, the National Unity Platform. And so it serves a chilling effect. And I think that unless we address those questions of accountability, the next election will not be any better. In fact, it will be worse. Simply because the people who are accused of perpetrating these violations, one, feel emboldened that they can do this and get away with it. There's no cost to grave human rights violations. In the recent reshufflement in the armed forces, the very individuals accused of these violations were promoted and have been given more responsibility in the armed forces. It makes all of us worry about the next election. So the next election cannot be any better unless you address the question of accountability arising from the last election. There has not been any attempt, at least in Uganda, to hold these individuals to account. Every attempt is being made to shield them from accountability. And I think that this will make them more emboldened. Our own investigations in the last election showed that the government had killed, and this is the state, extrajudicially killed 158 people during the elections. We were arrested midway that investigation. This information was confiscated because we visited mortuaries, we visited hospitals, we visited health centers, we visited families, and we had documented 158 people that had been shot and killed by the state. Regardless of what they were engaged in, there is no justification for extrajudicial killings by the state. And these killings have never been investigated. Calls for investigations have simply been brushed aside by the state. And so you cannot have a peaceful election unless you address the question of accountability for what happened in the last election.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate the point you made there, that key people who have taken credit historically for the killing of civilians in domestic situations in Uganda have consistently, I think, been promoted to new positions and rewarded. And so it's both a problem of impunity, but also the messages it sends within the hierarchy of the security forces that these kinds of abuses against civilians is a pathway to career success rather than a pathway to a career end. And it's, repeated throughout many different events in time. I wanted to just also ask Nicholas, historically over the last few decades, the U.S. military has been a fairly strong partner of the Ugandan military, obviously throughout the counter-LRA operations and in Somalia. There's been, trainings back and forth and a lot of support in different ways. We understand that support has shifted as the situation in terms of Uganda's democracy has deteriorated. But given that we're seeing the military courts be kind of instrumentalized against Uganda's domestic opposition activists, I wonder if you have thoughts on what that means for partnership with Uganda's military at this time. One of the things we've often heard is that the Ugandan military was better behaved outside Uganda's borders than inside Uganda's borders, and that has allowed certain kinds of collaboration for regional events to occur. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you have thoughts on what military engagement with Uganda means, given, Somalia and other spaces where Uganda has clearly played, an active role?
Well, I think that you have to understand the military economy and how the government of Uganda has used this military deployment outside the country as a foreign policy tool to placate themselves from domestic democratic deficits. And this has been very cleverly played in the sense that because we are active supporters in the global war against terror, we are willing to deploy soldiers across the continent. Therefore, we could excuse the killings by Ugandan armed forces in Uganda. I think that those countries must realize how complicit they have been in this process. It could have been unintended, but nonetheless complicit, because in the last election, we documented American military equipment that was supplied for the war in Somalia being used on the streets of Kampala to shoot and kill people. They were photographed and shared publicly. Clearly, this training, this support might have been useful outside the country, but in the country, they must realize these guns are being turned on political opponents of the regime and to some devastating effect. So they must realize their complicity, and I think make a quick decision whether they want to be complicit in this or they want to open a new chapter. I think that any such support to the Ugandan army must be with very strong conditions to avoid the use of those equipment on the Ugandan people. Secondly, we've had battalions of Ugandan soldiers for now over a decade being deployed in Somalia, trained and deployed in Somalia. When they come back, it is that training, it is that those resources that they apply to suppress domestic dissent. So in many ways, these governments that have supported the UPDF have been complicit, at least to the extent that their support has been used domestically to suppress dissent, and in many cases, disappear people, kill people on the streets of our country.
Yeah, thank you. I know you need to go, Nicholas, given that there's been so much news coming from Kampala today. So thank you so much for joining us. Agatha and I are going to continue our conversation about her investigations into corruption, which is, I know, related to all of this. But thank you so much for your generous time today, given it was such a busy day.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, CSIS, for having me. Always a pleasure. Good luck in the rest of your discussion. You have a wonderful investigative journalist and lawyer with you in Agatha. All the very best, and a good day.
Thank you. Good evening. So, Agatha, obviously we are looking forward to hearing about some of the work you've been doing to address corruption, because, you know, between what we're hearing about, you know, this issue of suppressing dissent, one of the things that's been very challenging in Uganda has been access to independent, corroborated information about what's really going on with, for example, budgets or access to government services that, you know, require state budgets. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit, particularly for those who haven't followed some of your amazing work on X, how did you get into these investigations, and what is the story behind some of the work you've done since you've started this organization, Agora, and worked to expose some of the corruption in Uganda's government and in NGOs and in different sectors?
So the work actually precedes Agora. We start the work doing things individually, the team that I later assembled, but the work is about system breakdown. You know, there are issues about water billing from the utility company that is supposed to give water that people cannot afford it because there's faulty in billings and no one ever checks it. There are no regulators that do that. There are questions about schools, universities, institutions of higher learning that are actually really ripping off parents and their children, but also failing children wrongly just because they are making a cut out of it. And everywhere I have encountered that, I have tried to bring it to light. And you're bringing it to light thinking that authorities will take this up and question these people. I will start with the Law Development Center that teaches the bar course, and it's the only institution that does that has really made it a point to frustrate young people that are pursuing that career, some of them who have committed suicide, others who end up with mental issues that last forever. And when I was there, I brought these issues to light. We petitioned the parliament, we petitioned the law council, we petitioned all these institutions that are supposed to sort of supervise it. And nothing happened even after, you know, documenting what was happening. So then we go into, of course, every time you would do that, you'd get people tipping you of something else going wrong, and you'd go into it and do investigations. At some point, about the 5 of us that were doing that individually came together and said, how can we handle this? So there's a colleague of mine called Jimmy Spire Sentongo that is a cartoonist and a columnist and a professor that started this brilliant idea of how do we engage the citizens, which is what Agora wants to focus on, that we have realized that at the end of the day, it's only the citizens of Uganda that are going to fight against these ills. They're the ones that give these people the mandate, and they're the only ones that can take it away. And it won't be one citizen. If we have seen, if there was any lesson to learn from Dr. Kizza Besigye, who was the leading opposition figure for a long time, and now Robert Kyagulanyi, who is the main opposition figure now, is that even them alone, even with all the charisma and the popularity, they cannot do it alone. You need to rally a significant number of Ugandans behind you. And these campaigns that Dr. Spire Sentongo came up with and we have been doing on X have really shown that it can happen. It will take probably a long time, but they were meant to say there's an issue here. Who knows more about it? Can we first expose what is happening? So it started with the pothole exhibition. The pothole is an exhibition that comes from the fact that there are no more roads in Kampala. Nothing. It will take you 2 hours to drive on a journey that would have taken you 10 minutes. So he asks, can we, because for him, this was intended to like mock the government that has failed to do this. People share pictures. It became crazy. Everyone, and it became the agency they got that now we are involved in talking about these issues, led to the president telling the Kampala City Council Authority to fix some of them, but you know the money that he was instructing that they be given was still not enough. But it made us realize that there's power in that collective and sort of. So we moved from that to the health exhibition. Now the health exhibition is the health sector is an issue close to everyone's heart. I did a lot of investigation. There's a researcher's carried out with a senior colleague in 2021 in the health and education sectors, and we found issues you'd think that things are bad, and you get there and find that you actually didn't know anything. They are worse than you thought. A doctor tells you how a woman died because there was no surgical blade, there was no things that would cost about $10, and because this woman doesn't have $10, but the hospital doesn't have them. The woman is stitched back and told to go to another hospital, which is about 1 hour drive. This is the woman already in labor, a child was almost on the way, but they realized that she could not push the baby and had to be taken to the theater, and there's no surgical blade. And there's no ambulance, and there's no fuel if there's ambulance. And that's how women die in labor in Uganda. Avoidable deaths that happen every day. So when we do the health exhibition, these issues come to the fore, that people that are in the western part, the northern part, the northwestern part of Karamoja, which is really the most neglected area. And we are thinking, how are these issues going to be resolved? In that one, no one ever responded, not to the Ministry of Health, no one. They only responded by sending threats to the proponent, Dr. Spire, that time. But we go on, like we thought even if there's no response, getting Ugandans to know about these things should be at least the starting point, that they are all going to get enraged about what's happening and demand, more fiercely for what they deserve to get.
Most recently, you had a lot of attention around the Parliament exhibition, and I want to make sure we have time for you to share a bit about what that exhibition exposed, because there's a lot of examples, I think, of the ways in which government services are poorly funded and poorly implemented, like the potholes, like healthcare, like education. But I think part of the challenge, is for people to understand that overall there is budget, right? That money exists within parliamentary coffers. So can you share with us a bit about what your investigation revealed?
Yes, so it starts from Parliament, and I'm glad we came to it because, one, it plays an budgetary allocation role of appropriation, but also oversight. It should be the one to go and find out where the money they have allocated, what it has done. So when you start by killing Parliament, you have really killed everything. Now, in the budget, in the exhibition of Parliament, I've been a parliamentary reporter since 2011, so maybe I should make that clear that I have interacted with that for a long time and made relationships there that would come and say, but we know you're the only one who can, because the intimidation and bribery and starts with the parliamentary press, that someone is intimidating them not to write about certain things. So when we come to it, we find out all the issues, of course, I have been reporting about, but at a smaller scale. You start with corruption, that the budget now has become a quid pro quo, carrot and stick issue, that when they are saying, but why are we giving State House so much money? The president, or classified budget, the president will call them and say, I know you want to increase your salaries, leave me with mine and do whatever you want with the rest. And that actually happens. So you find that Parliament allocates itself a big proportion of the budget, and also there's money that has been misused that came up in this exhibition, that they named corporate social responsibility funds that the speaker uses at will. You know, decides where to put it, and it has been her personal money. And this is in really billions and billions of shillings. Money that at Agora we are trying to say that the money she claims to have spent on a workshop could have built 5 schools or could have built 3 health centers. And we will come up with those figures to put it into perspective, that while you say that women are dying in labor because of lack of a surgical blade, there is money that someone is putting to her own use, is building a big house that she ferries all the MPs and everyone to go and attend, and pays them an allowance for going to attend that. And the issues mainly were recruitment issues, that they have recruited people without any adverts, people that also don't have any of the skills to work in the positions in the last
You mean
years.
in Parliament itself? That
Yes.
is, the parliamentary staff are underqualified?
Yes. No one cares about qualification. All it takes is that you are a judge and they know they will need you to help them with a case like the AHA case, to give an example, and you have a child that wants a job, and it has become a patronage tool as well. You go to issues of procedure, disregard of procedure. You heard Nicholas talk about the court saying that, they found out that the speaker did not follow procedure and her conduct in that case, because she was clearly partisan. She had told MPs that if they don't come to vote, they will be regarded homosexuals. And you know what that means in a society like Uganda. So all that is something that started early on. You are passing laws without quorum. You are passing laws without consultations. You are passing laws without giving the relevant committees time to scrutinize them. And this is where it ends, that some laws really goes to the root of people's livelihoods. But the biggest was abuse, misappropriation of these funds, but also when it comes to supplementary budgets. The MPs are bribed to pass supplementary budgets. The recent one was in December, the other day, and each MP was given 100 million shillings to pass the supplementary budget. All this comes to light, but also goes to show that the systemic failures you're seeing, that the health sector that is killing people rather than cure them, is coming from, one, a parliament that in appropriation does not prioritize critical sectors like that, but even after that, does not follow the relevant institutions to make sure that, because you will have no moral authority to follow up if the corruption starts with you. But also what these sectors do, it starts at budgeting, that the sectors will bribe MPs so that they give them a higher budget. It goes to oversight, that the sectors will bribe parliament so that they give them a clear go-ahead. And that happens all the time. So if you have a parliament as dead as the one we have, I doubt you are going to find anything that works in that parliament. But here's what is interesting about that expose we did about parliament. That all these issues, we brought them, receipts, how much money goes to the speaker, how much money they are using to say that they are on official leave abroad and they are paid for it per night, per diem of $4,000 per night. We brought all these receipts there, and we thought that there are institutions and graft agencies that are going to take this up. Nothing. You start with the IGG that says, I have no mandate to take it up. The Auditor General can take this up. Two of the officers have different mandate clearly. You go to police or DPP, and no one is going to raise a finger.
Yeah, I should point out, I mean, these accountability or institutions of government have been heavily invested in by funders over the years. Each time there's been a corruption scandal, several donors have come together to argue that these institutions require greater investment. I'm curious if you have thoughts on kind of to what extent those investments have yielded any fruit in terms of the fight against corruption in Uganda over the years. I will say we have about 10 minutes left. If anyone in the audience would like to submit questions, we'll try to reserve some time for that. But what do you see are if those investments have borne fruit, and then what would be the kinds of accountability investments that you think would be more likely to have an impact on, you know, these kind of endless cycles of exposure of corruption with so little redress?
As it is said by everyone, the issue is lack of political will to fight corruption. It is not lack of funds or investment in these agencies. Because at the end of the day, it will take the president being the one to tell the IGG to prosecute.
That's the Inspector General of Government, for people who don't
the
follow.
The Inspector General of Government in Uganda to investigate, the Directorate of Public Prosecutions to investigate, and it has always taken the president himself also to say, drop these charges. There was an iron sheet scandal that I am sure people heard about, where iron sheets meant for the Karamoja sub-region, which, like I've told you, people starve and die. You know, children are dying of hunger there. So part of the relief was to take to them iron sheets to have houses. And the politicians shared those iron sheets amongst themselves. It was clear. Some of them admitted, some of them returned them. But the president, a few that had been prosecuted, they dropped their charges. That can't be an issue of lack of investment. And for me, the development partners that have invested in that, but also invested in the entire financing of Uganda's budget, I think should demand for that accountability. It is really clear that the Ugandan citizens do not have that power, because the power was taken away from Ugandans a long time ago. They are now, in terms of, they give them handouts, and people think, yeah, we are going to vote because someone has given us $5 or something like that. So we think that development partners, in terms of giving this a push, and they have that power to demand for accountability in terms of what they have invested, hasn't been enough or hasn't been satisfactory. But still, I will give you one last example about the Parliament expose, that when we were in the middle of that expose and we thought we had really exerted a good amount of pressure, the president went to the Speaker of Parliament's home area to launch a hospital she has built there and named after the president's children, by the way, all the wards and sections of the hospital. And the president said that Anita Among, who is the Speaker of Parliament, is not the enemy of Uganda, that the enemies are us who are exposing her because we are agents of imperialists and homosexuals. And like what Nicholas said earlier about emboldening people that are involved in corruption, in human rights violations, that is one way of emboldening. That us who expose and were being threatened by the people we expose, the president gives them a go-ahead to not only just steal, actually, but also to threaten our lives. And that is where the biggest problem is. Everything in Uganda starts and ends with President Museveni. The moment he actually said that, the people that had been not talking or responding came and said, you can do whatever you want, you can milk this all you want for international attention. Because now they have been emboldened. They can steal and go and do whatever while Ugandans die of hunger and starvation and no painkillers in hospitals.
So much of your ability to galvanize attention on some of these issues has been dependent on social media as a space that was, let's say, less censored than the Ugandan media or radio or newspapers, where there was the ability to kind of share information and garner citizen engagement. Granted, not everyone can participate in social media, but it has been a more open space. It also has its vulnerabilities. I wonder if you have thoughts on kind of how you see the government tracking citizen engagement on social media and how you see that playing out, given that in the last couple of elections, the government has shut off access to the internet during elections specifically, that there was no Wi-Fi availability, and that Facebook remains shut off officially in Uganda for those who do not have a VPN or some other way of getting there. So social media has been a transformative tool to start these conversations, but ultimately, where does it go given its weaknesses as well?
Yeah, so I think like in a dictatorship, the government of Uganda likes to have a grip on everything. And they have had that grip on mainstream media, which I worked for the first 10 years of my journalism career, through advertisement, through, compromising a few people here and there. So comes social media that they don't have much control over, and now it's galvanizing people, and the president fears that it will be also something that you can incite people to rise up against him. And this starts in 2016 when he closed Facebook, and so that Ugandans can actually maneuver and get away of continuing to have access. So in 2021, he first closes Facebook, then later says, I'm going to shut down the entire internet. We know that will happen again towards 2026. But also before 2026, there was a law that was passed last year, the Computer Misuse Amendment Act, that criminalizes the use of social media. We challenged it in court, but the court has never had it. It's been so many months. So the maneuvers are there. We know that they are not going to keep quiet as we use that as a tool to galvanize people to see what is happening, but also to reach as many people as we can, to have all Ugandans have a say. In the newspapers, Ugandans didn't have a platform because you are writing and they are just reading after days or two. You didn't get that real-time reaction, and but now you do. You write something and it is viewed by thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and some are reacting to it, and that must scare them a lot. So we know that the maneuvers are coming. I don't know why they have not yet used that law to arrest some of us yet, but I'm sure it will come. But also we know that they will, as day follows night, shut down the internet. And I and my team, we work only on the internet, on social media mainly. So we have been trying to see if we have people we can partner with to see how to go about it, to see how to forestall that sort of crisis. I don't know if we will succeed, but it is something we are aware of, and we are looking for ways of dealing with it.
I want to ask two final questions in the 2 minutes that we have left. One, we have a question from the audience about what you think diaspora Ugandans based outside of Uganda can and should be doing to support the kind of work that you are doing to engage citizens on topics of lack of accountability for human rights abuses or corruption, and how they can be engaging different international partners such as the US or the EU or others. I'd also like to close with asking you about your own safety. Obviously, there's been a challenging history of charging human rights activists with crimes as a way to silence them. We know Nicholas himself faced arrest in around the last election, and NGOs have had accounts frozen and other things. I want to have a moment for you to reflect on your own security and the security of those doing this work with you, and what you would like to say to those who have threatened you all thus far.
Well, I'll start with the people in the diaspora. I think they have an opportunity more than us to actually engage. They are safer here where they cannot be reached, but also they will not have problems of internet shutdowns like us. So I think if we start this sort of collaboration, and if they don't know what's happening, they can talk to us who are on the ground, and we give them this information, and they engage really more actively than they are doing. That would help, because they are in a safer space. And one of the people that have done that well is Kakwenza, for example, that he's in exile, but he's really more vocal and bolder than the rest of us because he's out of their reach. I think another journalist, Remy Bahati. So I would like to ask all of them to sort of come together and know that they have the power we do not have, and the freedom and flexibility.
And on your own safety?
On my own safety, the threats have been, I have lived under threat for the last 3 years now, but also the arrests. All those are things you weigh before you go into this, but you just sort of, that cost-benefit analysis, that should I leave this, should I give up? And it's exactly what I was telling you about participation in elections, for example, that now everyone who goes to participate will go knowing that these are the likely consequences, but the consequences are not as important as what we stand to benefit in standing up against this regime or pushing back against these violations. I am aware of that. I live on the edge every day, looking over my shoulders, wondering if my children are safe. I don't care about my own survival for now. I think when you become a parent, yours is secondary, but when I started worrying, when I thought that even my children are in danger right now, they live with me, I move around with them, and I wonder if one day they will not come to attack me and I'm with the children, and that happens. But it's a fear you live with, but it's a fear that you do not let it sort of make you forget that Ugandans deserve better. The fear is deliberate, Maria. All that is deliberate, to hold people at ransom, to hold them in that fear so that they don't question them. I decided to defy that, and many others are doing the same. My team and colleagues, other Ugandans that I've seen, when we did the parliamentary exhibition, 2 Ugandans marched to parliament. They have been in jail. One is out. I think his case was being heard today. So that you're inspiring people to do that and stand up and say that we are not happy with what's happening is very important. And I hope we can all overcome fear. There's no way they will shoot all the 45 million Ugandans.
Well, we're grateful for your coming here today, for sharing your work with CSIS and the audience, and for continuing to work to expose the corruption that has made so many government services so paralyzed in Uganda. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for having this conversation with us also today on this day of the ruling in the Anti-Homosexuality Act. So thank you to all of our viewers and to Nicholas Opio, who joined us earlier. We're grateful for everyone, and we hope that the conversation will continue on social media and in other spaces to address the very challenging questions of accountability for human rights abuses and corruption as Uganda starts to think about preparing for the 2026 elections. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day.